There's no
Just go ahead.
there's no height that says after 20, 30,000 feet, it's negate. It's anytime you might be flying over, it's still
Something like that. We don't really, I think what we discussed in the past that there possibly is, but there's a lot of discussion as to where it might be, and it's one of those ambiguities. So we kind of just sort of leave, we just don't do it as a result. Um, we're going to talk when we get closer to the end, to closer to towards the end of the book. You get into much more practical examples. He tells you like, yeah, what are the real considerations like going to a museum, actually getting into an airplane. Right now, we're just sort of going through the halachic rubric so that we're familiar, so that we can start asking the interesting questions. Anyways, let's go to the next section, which is blocking tuma. It's possible to block tuma from transferring through doorways, windows, and other openings, and this can be done by one of two ways. So, in those, Jeff was mentioning earlier about a Kohen's room that has a window into the main chapel. How do we stop the impurity from going through that window from one room to the next? Well, one of the things that we said is that there's a prerequisite space, right? It has to be a tefach by a tefach in space. What happens if you have a window that's a tefach by a tefach? What can you do to perhaps block? What do you do about that space? Well, there are two ways that we can perhaps solve this problem. This can be done in one of two ways, either by completely sealing or blocking all of the openings to the room where the tuma is located. This is true even if one intends on removing the seal after the deceased has been removed. So that means you block it up completely. So that would mean, so for example, you can even take like a garbage bag, or you could take a sheet is not a good example, but you can take a plank of wood and cover over an opening, and that's adequate if it covers the entire opening, even if my intent is not to leave the item there ad infinitum. It's not going to remain there forever. As long as it's completely stopped up, that would be okay. So if you have that window that you're shutting closed, that would be an acceptable way to stop up that space because the window now blocks the opening from the one room to the next. But that's only if you're covering it in its entirety. What happens if you're, for example, closing a door and there's that little bit of space on the bottom of the door? What about in a case like that? Now, Alberta, if you'd like to move to this side where there's less sun, by all
I'm
means.
fine. I'm fine. I'm into the thing that you're doing. I don't want to distract myself.
Okay, very good. Um, or another alternatively is you can reduce the opening so that it's no longer a square tefach. But in this case, since you're still leaving a part open, the intent has to be that be whatever it is that you're adding be there permanently. If you're covering over the entire space, then it can be a temporary closure. If you're only just minimizing the space so that it's no longer now the prerequisite amount, then your intent has to be that whatever it is that you're adding has to be there permanently. Like you're adding an extra flame. What's that? Right, right. So one of the things, if you'll notice in the notes on the bottom, for those of you at home, you can see that I've actually highlighted it. But on the bottom here, where you see that little dot, you see the little circle, the little black thing on the bottom of the page. What is it? One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, 8 lines from the bottom in the footnotes. A door, when closed, is considered to be a permanent closure, even though it can be open and closed. If the door were to be considered a non-permanent closure, the tumor would spread via the airspace at the bottom of the door. Right. So even if it's a very small amount of area, it has to be considered as though you've permanently lessened the space. And for one reason or another, without getting into the complications, the door is not considered to be it is considered to be a permanent closure, even though it's going to be opened. Doors have this wonky place within halacha when it comes to the laws of Shabbos. When it comes, like for example, is the carrying opening a door out into a public domain? doors have a weird place in halacha because they're permanently attached to the ground. So they're considered to be a permanent structure, even if they get opened and closed. So a door is considered permanent, even if there's still an intent to open and close it. I'm just gonna just double check and make sure this is my wife because she is traveling and she is things going on.
Looking at your door and you're not there.
Because it's a permanent structure.
Right. Anywho, um, so what would an example be? Let's imagine that we have a little window over here. It's a tefach by a tefach, and I need to minimize the space so that the room that's next door is, and I want Kohanic to be here. I want the deceased. I want the funeral to take place next door. If I add a frame around it so that it's now no longer a tefach by a tefach, that would be adequate. And that would be adequate because a frame is something that you normally add, that is normally added permanently. It's not something that you ever really intend on removing. It might get removed eventually, but my intent is, as of right now, that it remain there permanently. Alternatively, I could just put a book in front of it and just tape it over the opening, and that would also be fine. Now, another thing to remember is that the screen itself, here, the window that I'm pointing at over here, has a screen, not because all the individual holes are less than a tefach by a tefach, and the screen is permanently attached. That is considered to be a adequate lessening of the space, and that's what I'm assuming I'm assuming that the the funeral home that you were was following halacha. That's what I assumed. Something along those lines was there. There might have been something.
I'm gonna go, I don't wanna go for a funeral, but I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna take a look because I was quite surprised at having learned this now. I didn't know at the time, but they opened those windows so people could see and hear. And
It's not always it's our Chaver Kedisha is very good when it comes to matters of halacha. Um,
I'm just wondering why you build a coin room if you're not going to build a for coin.
well, this is an Orthodox congregation. I'm an Orthodox rabbi, and this is a book written, for as a guideline to halacha. That's more likely than not to be the domain of sort of a scrupulously sort of halachic individual, which sort of is the domain of the Orthodox. Reform and conservative Judaism is not as hyper focused on the minutia as we are, and they often have their own system. And I'm not saying this in a way that's meant to delegitimize them in any way. Um, but it would not surprise me that if that depending on who this institution was catering to, that it would not meet perhaps our standards, but perhaps meets a standard that their community desires, wants, or perhaps doesn't know any better to ask for more. Um,
But it can be misleading to a coin off the street, not knowing. Well, I mean, I went to, this is an out of town place. I didn't know, and they ushered me into this place. I knew nothing that it was wrong at the time, but now I'm just curious.
another Cohen who regular attends this class sent me an email recently, and he asked me, like, when I was a young man, I went to Israel and I went on a tour, and they brought me onto the Temple Mount. Does that have, like, what do I do now? Was really the question. The answer I gave to him was like, this person is observant now. You keep Shabbat now. At one point you didn't keep Shabbat. This is kind of like the same thing. At one point you came to a degree of cognizance and observance, and now going forward you know better than perhaps going onto the Temple Mount. What you've done in the past is what was done in the past. You didn't know any better at the time, and you can't be held accountable for things that were not you're not of which you're not conscious of. And I'd say the same thing here. If somebody ushered a Kohen into a room like this and the Kohen didn't know any better, the Kohen bears no responsibility or fault here. It was an accident. It was a well-intentioned effort on somebody's part to make somebody feel welcome, and nobody did anything wrong. It was an accident.
Give him a chicken wire, I'll bring that.
Chicken wire, right. The blocking material must be sturdy so that it will not move in the wind and it will remain in place without any additional support. So it has to be something that's stable, like it has to be there that's attached. It has to be something that will be present and will not be moved easily. Any item, however, this is an interesting discussion. Any item that it itself can become impure, it is susceptible to tuma. What the Hebrew word is here, it can be makabel tuma, cannot serve to block tuma. The idea is that tuma has to be stopped by something. And we're saying what stops the impurity? Well, something that cannot become impure itself. Item
Hmm?
chicken wire cannot become impure. No, I don't believe so. Okay, but we'll talk about that in a second. We'll get to in a second. But things that are generally made to be attached to the ground are not considered to be utensils or things that that are susceptible to becoming impure. We'll talk about it in a second. However, something that isn't makabel tuma will block the impurity. The blockage can be of any material that isn't a utensil. Examples include wooden boards and plastic sheeting. These sorts of things you can use to stop up the impurity. Um, I'm just going to skip a little bit. Um, we're going to skip over to page 22 to the second line. Accordingly, the Taz, who's one of the commentators to the Shulchan Aruch, page 22, third line, that door hinges are utensils, and thus a door hung with hinges will not block the spread of the impurity. He says, however, the Shach, however, argues and says anything that was produced for the explicit purpose of being attached to the ground or a building, regardless of its material construct, is not considered to be something that is susceptible to tuma. And therefore, say even though a door is attached with metal hinges, and metal hinges are holding the door, and metal hinges are made out of metal, because they're designed specifically for the purposes of holding a door in place onto the sides of a building, which is attached to the ground, in that case, it's considered to be an extension of the home and are not considered to be utensils. Thus, according to this, something akin to chicken wire, I believe, which is made to be attached to the ground as part of a fencing structure, could be used for this as well. I mean, you can ask the same thing. What about a chain link fence? Can a chain link fence, let's say you had a chain link fence that was up in front of this window, and you had a room next door. Probably the chain link fence could also act to block the impurity for this in the same way that the screen does, right? Or remember screens used to be made of metal, so yeah, it's much the same thing.
So at the cemetery, bedside cemetery,
Uh-huh.
the chain link fence
Uh-huh.
separates the outside from the inside. But the branch of a tree negates the chain link fence.
That's right. Well, remember, here we're talking about blocking up openings to.
Yes, true. Yes. Okay.
So we're not exactly talking. It's not an apples to apples comparison. That's a good question. That's right. So this is actually interesting. And this is actually what we actually do rely on quite a bit, especially when it comes to hospitals. Remember, hospitals have morgues. Hospitals have a whole lot of, potential, parts of bodies, and dead bodies as well, but they also have a whole lot of doors. Take a look at this. A set of double locking doors can be made to isolate the Kohen from the Tuma for example, when something needs to be given to a Kohen, one door can be opened while the other remains closed, similar to an airlock. Take a look at in the back. I reproduced what were these called? The figures in the back. So you have on page 8, should be on page 89. But in the images, you have underneath the Foster Avenue, which is the street that Telz Yeshiva is on, where Shalom Mordechai is now. You have the Bohemian Cemetery and this giant tree that extends over graves onto Foster Avenue. So Kohanim do not walk on that sidewalk. Directly underneath, you can see a picture here. And for those of you at home, you have the deceased on this side. You have the Kohen all the way on the right. And you can see that you have two sets of doors here. As long as you have one door closed, the impurity does not extend from one room to the next. What's that? Well, remember we said that a door, because it's considered to be permanent, all it needs to do is minimize the space so that it's less than a tefach by a tefach, right? If it's a non-permanent if it's non-permanent, then it has to cover the entirety. If it's a permanent addition, if it's a permanent thing that we're adding, then it's just minimizing the space that's no longer a tefach by tefach. Then all we need to do is lessen it so that it's no longer a tefach by tefach. In this case over here, also, since the door is considered permanent for one reason or another, the closed door, even if there's a space underneath, is now makes it so that is in it's enough so that the space underneath, which is less than a tefach by a tefach, will not convey the impurity from one room to the next. So you have two. You can rely, for example, in a hospital when you have so many doors and so many fire doors, that wherever the body is, you can safely rely on that and say that that there's always going to be at least one door closed between me and the body. The There's one complication to this, and this is where things get super complicated, and that's the concept of the sof tuma lotzes. We're going to read the first paragraph or so, and then we're going to call it an evening. But we're on page 23, middle of the page. It says exits and passageways through which the corpse will be removed, even if they're not currently exposed to the tumas mace, are considered tame. This halacha is known as sof tuma lotzes. In the end, the tuma, or in this case, the deceased, will live through the exit. So what does that mean? So that means, for example, let's say that we have I'm just going to use I'm assuming you're all familiar here with the architecture of the show. Let's imagine that we have a mace in the kitchen, and the mace can go out through the hallway in the back, through to the hallway over here that's just outside our classroom, and through the front, through the main sanctuary, and then out through the front door. Right. And it can completely, as long as the doors remained closed, it can completely circumvent or can circumnavigate around the social hall and never enter the social hall. So therefore, if we have doors that are closed between from the kitchen and all and this and this and this and the social between the social hall and everywhere else, the social hall is never considered tame as long as those doors remained closed. But let's imagine for a moment that one of the other that there was no way to remove the mace any way other than the social hall. In that case, a person who is in the social hall, even with the door closed, the door is not considered to be a barrier because the mace will eventually come through the social hall. Since the mace is definitely going to come through the social hall, the door is not considered to be a barrier. And so even with all the doors closed, a Kohen cannot remain in that room, even if the mace has not yet been brought through that room. The idea again is that if we know the path that the mace, the dead body, is going to take, then that place is considered to be, as long as it's attached through a structure and it only has sort of doors and other kinds of blockages, as long as it's connected, the blockages are not considered to be valid blockages, as we know that the mace will eventually come through that door. That door will eventually be opened. Well, as long as the mace, what's that? Right, exactly. So the Kohen would have to. Remember, we said that you can block off one room from the next by closing the door?
understood that part, but I didn't know that could be under the same.
Under the same roof, right? Because the door blocks it off, so it's not considered to be connected, right? It's so right. So right. We spoke about the double door as well. So it's a very complicated area. We're going to talk about this next week. We'll speak to this much further. But I did want to introduce the idea at the very least. But the idea it's called Sof Tumalotzes, which is that as long as it's part of the same structure and the mace is in room A, and you know that the mace is going to be brought through room B, even if you've done everything to halakhically seal it up so that they're not considered to be connected through doors or whatever the case may be, it's still considered to be connected, and the social hall will be considered to be impure, and we would tell the Kohen he can't remain there. The Kohen would have to be in a different location. The Kohen would have to move somewhere else. Because since the body will be brought through this room, they're considered connected, and therefore the impurity is considered to be present even with the closed door. And we'll open up now to questions, comments, and rebuttals, and we'll bring the class to a conclusion.
So the cemetery, so the service here,
Uh-huh.
which isn't, you have to be mindful of being at the front where there's an overhang.
Uh-huh.
You have to be mindful that if the body was brought inside, when they used to do that here, I believe, once or twice, I think they did. It was in an open area in the front here. If the Kohanic came from the back door into the social and stayed there with the doors closed, then this door and that door, the Kohanic would stay there.
Yes, but it wouldn't be advisable because there's always that Schmendrick who's going to open the door. Unless we got double doors, and we don't have double doors.
One set of doors.
Right, we have to make sure that they're all closed, and that's often not the
There's
case.
something also about having the body in the presence of the Torahs in the sanctuary. Is that something else too? I mean, not for Tamei, I guess, but
yeah, there is something that we generally don't. Even a Beth Tzedek, I don't believe they bring the body into the sanctuary, do they?
no, it's in the hallway.
It's in the hallway.
I don't know if I've ever seen one inside.
Yeah, you don't bring it into the sanctuary for that reason, and that's a little bit more difficult with our show, the way how we're constructed. It's hard to argue that it's not in the sanctuary once it's brought into the building. It's complicated. It's not just local to Calgary. Most shows have really stopped allowing bodies into the. I want to say I don't want to sound quite like that. Funerals are not held in shows often, very rarely. It'll occasionally happen, but very rarely. Very rarely. All right, and we'll continue. Yashikach, everyone.